In order for the ancient Egyptians to go about their daily lives and make a living, they needed to have a job or a trade. But imagine a world without money. How could you earn anything from your work or meet your basic needs? In ancient Egypt, money wasn't introduced until around 300 BCE during the Ptolemaic period. Before that, people met their needs by trading goods they had for items they needed. In other words, a barter system was in place. For example, let's say you're a farmer and you've harvested some wheat. You could trade that wheat for a plow, something you need to till your land again, from someone who makes plows. But what if the plowmaker doesn't need your wheat and instead wants a clay pot? Then you'd first have to trade your wheat to a potter in exchange for a pot, and only then could you trade that pot for the plow. If the potter also doesn't need wheat, you'd have to find something they need first. As you can imagine, this barter system could quickly become complicated. In order for a product to be traded, its value had to be determined. Less valuable goods were measured in amounts of copper, while more valuable ones were measured in silver. Since silver was rarer than gold in ancient Egypt, it was considered even more valuable. The basic unit of measurement was called the deben. 10 copper debens were equal to 1 silver deben. 1 silver deben weighed about 95 grams of silver. For example, 1 keels of grain, roughly 37 liters, was valued at 1 copper deben. A small farm of around 4 fedans, roughly 4 acres, was worth about 3 silver debens. So, if someone wanted to buy this farm with grain, they would need to pay the owner 30 kiles of grain. That's about 1,110 liters. If you had copper or silver as raw metal, you could also use it like money in such transactions. However, very few people actually possessed copper or silver. Unlike today, the ancient Egyptians didn't have fixed work hours, weekdays, or holidays. Most people worked every day simply to survive and meet their basic needs. Only during special religious festivals would work stop, and people would gather in front of temples to watch ceremonial processions. As a result, they didn't have a 7-day week like we do today. Instead, their calendar was divided into 3 seasons, each made up of 4 months. Each month had 30 days. These seasons weren't based on weather, like summer or winter, but on the behavior of the Nile. The first was the flood season, when the Nile overflowed, followed by the emergence season, when the waters receded, and finally the harvest season, when crops were gathered. During the flood season, when the fields were underwater, people focused on repairing their homes and farming tools. In the emergence season, as the waters receded, irrigation canals were repaired and planting began. Then came the harvest season, when crops were gathered, processed, and used to meet people's needs. Since each month had 30 days, Egyptians worked in this seasonal cycle for 360 days a year. The remaining 5 days were reserved for New Year celebrations. Like us, the Egyptians divided the day into 24 hours. To measure time, they would light a candle marked with horizontal lines. As the candle melted and the lines disappeared, they could track the hours. Another method involved a water clock, a container marked with lines that dripped water. The remaining water inside indicated the time of day. Such tools were used for appointments and scheduling. However, an ordinary farmer didn't need such methods. The position of the sun and moon was enough for them. The concept of minutes didn't exist at all. In ancient Egypt, the majority of the population were farmers. Each year, the Nile River would flood and deposit rich layers of alluvial soil, renewing the land and making it ready for planting. The timing for sowing and harvesting was well established and followed annually. Shepherds also benefited greatly from the fertile Nile Valley. But they had to be cautious of river crocodiles and desert hyenas. After farmers, the second largest professional group was scribes. Considering there was no printing press and everything had to be written by hand, it makes sense that scribes made up a significant portion of the population. Since there were no formal schools in ancient Egypt, reading and writing were taught in temples. Most of those who learned to write were boys, and not every Egyptian received an education. Children selected to become scribes were often the sons of high officials, or, occasionally, bright children from farming families. These chosen few received literacy training to prepare them for administrative roles. Education in ancient Egypt began with memorizing hieroglyphic symbols. Since papyrus paper was expensive, students used reusable tablets and wooden boards for repetitive practice. Once students learned to read and write, they could advance to more specialized subjects like mathematics and construction. They were taught how to solve practical problems, such as calculating the number of bricks needed for a specific sized wall, the amount of food a soldier would need over a set period, or how many workers were required to move a large obelisk. Artisans who performed delicate, skilled work also formed an important professional class. Sculptors, painters, jewelers, carpenters, and blacksmiths were among the most notable craftsmen. Even though they left behind thousands of remarkable statues, tomb paintings, and monumental works that still amaze us today, they were not as highly valued as scribes. None of them could sign their names on their creations because what they made was not seen as art, but as ordinary labor. It was simply how they earned their living. Another group of workers were traders and middlemen. These individuals didn't produce anything themselves, but acted as intermediaries for those who wanted to exchange goods. They would either help facilitate trades or sell the items directly in the markets. They also played a key role in supplying raw materials. A large portion of the population worked in what were considered the worst jobs, quarrying and mining. These were extremely exhausting and dangerous occupations with harsh working conditions. Workers often suffered from severe joint injuries and lung problems caused by constant dust exposure. Fatal accidents were also common. Because of this, one of the harshest punishments for criminals was being sentenced to work in quarries or mines. Slaves were also commonly forced to labor in these places. As for other free laborers, many of them were performing corvée service, forced labor in exchange for food, barely enough to survive. One of the toughest jobs was working in the swamps of the Nile Delta. The main task of the swamp people was collecting papyrus plants, which were essential for making paper. Because the swamps were also rich in fish, fishing was another common occupation. Papyrus wasn't just useful for making paper, it was also a versatile material used for building shelters and boats. To make paper, the papyrus plant was first cut into thin strips. These strips were then laid out in horizontal and vertical layers and pounded with a mallet. As the layers were compressed, their natural sap acted as a glue, bonding them together. Finally, the sheet was pressed and dried, turning it into usable paper.